12. May 1945. Munich, American Zone. In a notebook stitched from salvaged paper, a German civilian wrote, "We will be asked to build a new house on a foundation of silence." He wrote it quickly, in a cramped hand, and then did not show it to anyone. It was the kind of thought that could not be said aloud in the ruins. It is the thesis of his life after 1945. Put differently, the war after the war was arithmetic of hunger, of guilt, of rooms, of memory. And it would be fought not with rifles, but with ration cards, questionnaires, and the careful management of what could be said. He signed that notebook entry, Carl 35, and underlined the date twice. He did not know if his mother was alive. He did not know where his younger brother had gone in the last weeks, when the Volkssturm swallowed men whole. He did not know why the cathedral still stood when the street of his childhood had collapsed into brick and splinters. He knew, with a kind of cold certainty, that the Americans had come to stay for a while, that the curfew was real, and that there would be a reckoning of some kind. The streets around him were rubble landscapes. The German word learned new edges in 1945. Trümmer, debris, ruin, and the women who climbed it were called Trümmerfrauen, women of ruins. They moved bricks with bandaged hands, taught themselves the mathematics of salvage. 5 good bricks from a dozen smashed, 10 good out of 30 by noon, 18 by dusk if the mortar gave easily. They wore headscarves and borrowed handcarts. Some wore former factory goggles to keep the dust out of their eyes. An American military report from that second week of May noted simply, "Women in Munich are doing much of the work. Men scarce." The men were dead, missing, in camps, or in uniform without weapons, waiting for news. Allied occupation forces entered with lists and loudspeakers. The first orders were simple and harsh. Curfew at 9. No gatherings of more than 3. Weapons surrendered. A poster on a half-burned wall told residents to stay off the street unless ordered. Families suspected retribution. Stories traveled faster than bread. An SS man shot by a corporal, a party official dragged from a cellar. Most of it was rumor. Some of it was true. The fear was statistical before it was personal, the arithmetic of risk after defeat. Walked at 10, fined. Walked at midnight, arrested. Carried a pistol, shot. Arrest quotas were explained in occupation reports in neutral language, then applied in alleys where German and English were both thin. Carl returned to an apartment he had left in January, ultimately locked by neighbors when the blasts grew too frequent. He found the kitchen door hinge buckled. He found a spoon under a spill of plaster. He found a postcard from 1939, sealed beneath a fallen beam. He had been a junior accountant for the municipal utility. It was not an important job. It was steady. He had a party badge he had asked for and received in 1937 because it had been expected of him. He placed it in the bottom of a drawer then and rarely wore it. He had been called to sweep streets for the Volkssturm, then sent home. He had believed, not in the cause, but in the frame of ordinary life, continuing if he did not look too long in any one direction. He did not yet have a language for that belief. He had a hunger instead, and a capacity to count. He began to count because 1945 in Munich was arithmetic. There were calories. There were minutes of curfew. There were kilometers of railway gone to scrap. To eat meant ration cards. To get ration cards meant finding the new office. To find the office meant crossing districts where the sound of boots slowed everyone's gait. The Americans set up a supply system quickly and then watched it strain. The British did the same in their zone, the Soviets in theirs. Numbers from the American zone, OMG-US, Office of Military Government, United States, spoke of daily caloric allotment averages and urban-rural differentials. In Munich, the average was less than a man's body needed. A woman and child received less. The mathematics of hunger did not consult the mathematics of justice. Children with hollow eyes did not present their parents' party cards. In a report dated 1 June 1945, an American officer wrote, "The public mood is restless, resigned, still uncomprehending of the totality of their national crime." The words were clinical, and they belonged to the narrator's glass box voice, the voice of archives and bureaucrats. It is the voice that will accompany Karl from the rubble to the office and back, a cool, analytic cadence that reads a city as a case file. There were missing family members. Notices went to trees, names chalked on walls, telegrams pinned to bulletin boards. A mother who went to Dresden for her sister's wedding and never returned. A boy last seen near the Isar bridges. A husband in Posen in January. Then no further word. The landscape was missing people. It was missing roofs. It was missing roofs. It was missing sequence. The Allied occupation forces brought with them the possibility of sequence again, rule of law, at least an occupying law, and the slow restoration of municipal calendars. But it would also bring a new kind of equation, a calculus of the past, that would be done with forms. On 17 July 1945, Karl heard about the Fragebogen, the questionnaire. 131 questions to sort, classify, strip, or reassign. Are you now or have you ever been? The logic was American and German and general to make a mass society legible. It took the form of Allied Control Council Directive, number 38, October 1946, which set out 5 categories: Hauptschuldig, major offenders, Belastete offenders, major offenders, Mittelestate offenders, Mittelleife followers, Entlastate exonerated. But it began in 1945 with the feeling of paper. A form could move a man from a housing list to a job list to a prison list. This was the mathematics of guilt, the arithmetic of checkboxes and signatures, the numbers of how many would be punished and how many would be needed to repair a city. Karl picked up his form from a folding table under a tarpaulin. He filled in his name. He filled in his birthplace. He confessed, if that is the word, that he had joined the party in 1937 out of conformity and had served no function beyond his job as an accountant. He had donated nothing. He had attended few meetings. He had not profited from Aryanization. In fact, he had kept accounts for municipal water and had never been asked to evict a Jew. He wrote that last line and then crossed it out. It was too particular to be credible. He replaced it with, "I did not participate in anti-Jewish action." He had watched. He had kept his eyes on columns and sums while people across the street were moved from one apartment to another, then taken away. He remembered one woman, older than his mother, who had asked about her water bill in September 1941 because it had been higher than usual, even though her husband was gone to labor. He had not asked where. He had explained the meter's error and said he would adjust it. He did adjust it. He did nothing else. The mathematics of memory accrues interest. He did not know that then. The Spruchkammern judicial panels began hearings in 1946. In Bavaria, they sat often in cold rooms with tall windows, hearing 30 cases in a day. Witnesses testified, denouncers wrote letters, neighbors found their voices for whatever it was they wanted. A democratic ritual under Allied supervision, imperfect, hasty, and subject to the pressure of need. The cities needed engineers. The schools needed teachers. The police needed policemen. The mathematics of denazification had to be balanced against the mathematics of reconstruction. The dilemma was evident in occupation reports. There is a tension between thorough justice and the requirements of stability. Local administrators urge leniency. The public expresses fatigue with process. Shortages exacerbate all feelings. It read like a summary of a city's psychology. Karl was called in February 1947. He wore a suit that smelled faintly of smoke and damp. He sat before 3 Germans appointed to judge him on behalf of the occupation. A file lay before them with his Fragebogen, photocopies of two internal letters from the utility. One from 1939, with a line of approval for a properly organized employee event. Another from 1942, reminding workers to contribute to winter relief. None of it was damning. None of it was damning. A neighbor wrote a letter. Karl has always been decent. He never advanced at the expense of others. An American observer sitting in the back took notes with an air of professional detachment. Case 4711, minor party member, administrative function. No evidence of active crimes. Recommend classification as Mitläufer. Fine. The fine was small and would be paid through withheld ration coupons, a bureaucratic punishment that fit a bureaucratic role. Outside, in the courtyard, a woman cried quietly after being labelled a belastet. She had been a block warden. Inside, a man argued that he had just followed orders in his factory job when he confiscated radios. The panel assigned percentages of blame with a tired, procedural tone. A study from the period would later calculate that in some regions in the American zone, fewer than 1% would be labeled major offenders. The majority, perhaps as high as 3/4 of those processed, would be Mitläufer or exonerated. The arithmetic of guilt was top-heavy, then quickly became bottom-heavy. The system needed engineers and secretaries, and it needed acceptance. A pure purge would have kept the rubble intact. That same winter, the hunger came. Not the hunger of letters and hearings, but the biological hunger that makes arithmetic of everything else. In the winter of 1946-47, the rations dropped to levels that made work difficult and life slow. Potatoes froze in the ground. The Kohl-Rubin winter, the winter of turnips, tested stomachs and patience. Allied occupation reports spoke carefully of caloric deficits and reportedly increased incidents of theft from agricultural storage. But the experience was simple: a bowl of thin soup at midday, a piece of black bread if a neighbor had extra, a desperate barter of a ring for a sack of coal. The black market flourished. Zoo in Berlin, Stackus in Munich. In both places, the mathematics of cigarettes became the arithmetic of survival. American brands acquired a value that could be plotted: 2 packs for a kilogram of butter, 5 for a pair of shoes, 10 for a small sack of flour. The mathematics of occupation, the currency of the most powerful institution, becomes the currency of the street. The Americans tried to suppress the market and failed. Reports speak of stings, fines, raids, rolled-up cigarettes in coat linings. A new urban expertise grew up in the ruins. How to find a glazier to fix a window in exchange for a pound of bacon. How to measure a kilogram with a hand. How to hide a sack of coal on a bicycle with a child perched on top, pretending to ride. It was ugly and ordinary and far more organized than the word black market suggests. It is in the black market that Karl met the man who would give the story its second thread, the Polish Catholic who had hidden Jews and then faced communist suspicion. His name was Stanisław. He used the surname Mazur sometimes, and sometimes another, because every DP had several names. Displaced person. The capitals mattered in the administration and in the way Germans said the words, slowly, with a faint mixture of pity and suspicion. The American zone was full of DP camps: Feldafing, Landsberg, Fürstenwald. They were worlds within the world, run by UNRRA and then the IRO, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and then the International Refugee Organization. They had their own newspapers, cultural committees, schools, even courts. They had fences, they had guards, they had markets. Some had funerals that the local German population would glimpse and then look away from. Stanisław was from Lublin. He wrote, born 1916 on his documents when he first registered at Fürstenwald. Later he would write, born 1918 to fit an emigration quota. He spoke German haltingly and Polish easily, with a bit of Yiddish absorbed by years in a city of multiple tongues. In 1942, he had hidden a Jewish girl and her aunt in a potato cellar for nearly a year. He had done this because a friend had asked, and because he had the cellar. He had done it because he had been specific in his refusal. He refused to be a cog in that machine. And then he had joined the Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, because he felt he could be predestined to carry messages, to deliver bread, to transport a pistol wrapped in a cloth inside a basket. In 1944, he had helped in the chaos of a failed uprising in the region, watching German columns fire at anything that moved and then moving when the columns were gone. After the war in 1945, the Polish Communist Security, Ursid Bezpieczeństwa, took notes on him. Suspected AK, they wrote. Possible sympathy with Western intelligence. This was a category that was malleable. It included anyone who was not useful to the new order. It included Catholics with strong views and peasants who did not hurry to join a cooperative. It included men like him who had hidden Jews for a year and then watched as rumor turned him into other people's uses. In 1946, he slipped into the American zone because he had a cousin who had a friend who knew a man with a truck and cigarettes. He declared himself a displaced person and filed the forms. He carried with him a piece of paper signed by a Jew now in the British zone. He hid us. It was not a certificate. It was a sentence. It did not protect him from suspicion by communist agents who roamed the DP camps discreetly, seeking out AK men and those who might be induced to return. He learned the mathematics of another kind. 2 visits from a man with a red tie and a soft voice in Polish meant you were on a list. 3 meant you should leave that barrack for another. 4 meant you should find allies among the Americans or Jews. 5 meant you were already too late. He sold things on the black market because the DP ration, while above the German ration for much of 1946, did not cover a man's needs, and because a man who waited for official channels would wait too long. He traded cigarettes. He carried messages between the camp and the city. He stayed wary. He kept his shoulders tight. He was the kind of man who made many friends and no one who could describe him fully. He and Karl met because Karl's neighbor needed another meter of roof felt and a kilo of flour and a small bag of coal, and Stanisław knew a Polish railroad worker with access and a German widow with an extra bag of potatoes. The black market was an introduction service as much as a market. Stanisław said in simple German, "I can find it." He said, "You have something?" Karl had American toiletry soap 2 bars that a cousin had received in a care package and passed along. They completed their trade after dark, walking in the slow, cautious way people walk when boots and flashlights are common. The mathematics of scarcity pulled German civilians into contact with people they had barely known existed before the war. In a town like Munich, there were few Jews to be seen. They had been deported starting in 1941. The remainder had been pressed into forced labor and then deported too. The camps nearby, Dachau, were a source of ghosts and were in any case controlled by the Americans now. Most of the men and women with yellow stars who now passed through the streets in small groups, wearing borrowed coats and eating bread in a careful way, were displaced persons, survivors of camps, or forced laborers from the East. The Allied authorities forced German towns to see what had been done in their name. Photographs were posted, films were shown. There were tours. And there were strategies of denial. It was not our fault. We did not know. It was the party. It was the SS. The pronouns were tools. They did it. Then we suffered too. Then It is time to rebuild. All of this appears in oral histories recorded in the early 1950s and in occupation reports titled Public Attitudes, which talk about an increasing particularization of guilt away from the collective. Germans learned the mathematics of victims. There were categories of suffering and implied exchange rates that were never printed but often spoken in private. A family from East Prussia arrived with a story of walking for days on roads under fire from Soviet aircraft. A man from Hamburg told of his wife and children buried under rubble during the firestorm. A woman from Silesia told of assaults during the flight west. These stories were true and were used to build a new moral arithmetic in which we could speak in the same register as they, meaning the Jews and others. This was human and also evasive. It built a foundation for the new state in the West and a different kind of foundation in the East. It layered facts slowly, like mortar between salvaged bricks. The editorial voice of the time, the official statements, the schoolbook passages would come to emphasize the consequences of war and the perils of dictatorship, while naming the specifics only sometimes. In the meantime, there was work. The women in scarves cleared streets with shovels and their hands until small trucks could move. The men who returned from camps or from the east learned to carry bricks at pace. A city birthed a labor again, rubble to be cleared, tram lines to be repaired, pipes to be relayed. Karl found a place in the city's new office for food distribution and housing allocation. It was an ordinary office with extraordinary power, because to assign a ration or a room was to dictate survival for a season. The mathematics of rooms became his daily arithmetic. 15 families arrived from Königsberg, a mother, 2 children, an elderly couple, 3 men with missing fingers, 2 girls who had not spoken since January, now 1947, in any voice above a whisper. They needed beds. They needed 4 walls. The office was a map of rooms. This family can share that one. That widow can take in a boy. These 3 can sleep in the kitchen in the boy. These 3 can sleep in the kitchen in the back if they do not complain. The windows still had no glass. The displacement was continental. By 1947, millions of Germans had been expelled or fled from the east, from Silesia, East Prussia, Pomerania, the Sudetenland. They arrived with bundles and smells of the road. They brought their dialects, their resentments, and their claim to belong. The locals, who had survived bombings and hunger in place, met them without enthusiasm. "They take our jobs," said a man in a beer hall in July 1947, and an Allied intelligence summary recorded the complaint without comment. The arithmetic of scarce rooms became a friction point. A widow whose husband had died in the army did not want to share her kitchen with a woman whose husband had died in a prison camp. Both argued in the language of deserts. The new authorities assigned rooms with stamps, seals, and a tone of unsympathetic necessity. "You must accept them," said a clerk who would later be called a Democrat for enforcing the law. The policy was not neutral. It was designed to integrate millions. It was not designed to make them feel welcome. It was a system. Feelings ran along the edges of the official lines. In his notebook, Karl wrote in October 1947, "The arithmetic of rooms destroys friendships and creates resentments, but it gives children a place to sleep. 5 people in 2 rooms, then 6 in a kitchen and room, then 7 with a thin wall between. We are all counting beds." He wrote perhaps because he had no one to say it to. He wrote because writing was a kind of rationing of memory, 1 line for every day. Stanislaw watched this, partly from the outside and partly through the economic life that ran under the administrative structure. He disliked the communists. He disliked the Nazis. He had a sharp sense that both could wear a badge and use the same words about order, each turning individuals into categories. He saw that the Americans were a third thing, practical, hungry for results, capable of kindness, capable of indifference to a history they had not lived. He moved through the DP camp with a practiced neutrality, waiting for news of visas. Canada was possible, Argentina less so for a Catholic with his profile, the United States difficult without a sponsor. He went to the camp office to put his name on lists. He wrote statements. I hid them. I will sign any oath. I have no communist ties. The IRO case file on him, if we could read it now, would say something like, AK sympathies not of concern. Affidavits from Jewish survivors. Approved for resettlement pending quota. The DP world was built of these phrases. He sometimes visited the Jewish camp residents. The relationship between Polish Catholic DPs and Jewish DPs was complicated. There was solidarity. Both were unwelcome in their pre-war homes in 1945 and 1946, and there was resentment born of pre-war and wartime strains. In the camp at Fehrenwald, the Jewish survivors organized their own schools, their own theater, their own court. They had a committee that sought to track down those who had aided and those who had betrayed. Names were remembered. Names were erased. A woman who had survived in Warsaw wrote a letter in 1947 for Stanisław. He kept us in his cellar at the risk of his life. He fed us turnip soup and bread when there was none. He brought a doctor once when my aunt coughed blood. We lived because he willed it. She was now in the British zone, preparing for Palestine if a boat could be found. She signed her name and included an address in a village near Hanover. It was not the kind of letter a German police official would value. It was the kind of letter that would matter later when another war of memory would begin. During these years, German civilians also confronted the proximity of victims and the usefulness of denial. They read newspapers under Allied licenses. They listened to radio programs arranged by the occupation that spoke of re-education. The number of Allied films shown about the camps was high in 1945 and 1946, then declined as the priorities changed. The German public demonstrates an increasing tendency to speak of our suffering, one American report said in late 1946, and to distinguish between the party and the people. That distinction would become common sense in the 1950s. It was an anesthetic. It was also a way to live. In June 1948, the mathematics changed. The currency changed. The old Reichsmark became paperless than paper. The new Deutsche Mark arrived like a sermon with hymns. The day before the reform, shops had empty shelves. The day of, they filled with goods that had been hidden in back rooms, under tables, in children's rooms. It felt like a deception and like a miracle. The black market collapsed in a week. Men who had made fortunes with cardboard suitcases full of cigarettes found themselves with worthless inventory. And the shopkeeper down the street who had held back shoes for his cousins now held shoes in his window. The phrase, the collapse of the black market, belongs to an economic history textbook. The thing itself looked like shelves with bread on them and a line that moved quickly for once. It felt like physics being repealed. The Americans called it reform. The Germans called it normal. And the next 2 years were the beginning of something that would later be called Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. It was not a miracle. It was the mathematics of American capital, German labor and training, European integration, and a peace that held longer than expected. The Marshall Plan shipments arrived, stamped with the name of a man whose plan was reduced to a label on sacks of flour and containers of industrial equipment. Cement, steel, meat, powdered milk. Factories restarted. New factories appeared. In the Ruhr, the chimneys lit in a new pattern. In Munich, a small plant for radio components opened in a former barracks. Men who had worn uniforms put on coveralls. Women who had worn uniforms put on coveralls. Women who had cleared rubble took jobs in offices. Karl's office became busier, then less urgent. He moved from ration cards to a desk in a department that planned new housing blocks, a district with square courtyards and straight lines, a functional utopia for ordinary people. He felt relief and something like shame as he watched the first apartments go to families whose husbands had been dismissed from the police in 1945 and were now reinstated. Article 31 of the new Basic Law would restore the pensions and positions of many former civil servants. It was not called a retreat. It was called the rightful restoration of a career independent of the crimes of a regime. The politics made sense. The system needed experience. The mathematics of state building in 1949 to 1951 suggested that one could not fire the majority of a bureaucracy and still have a bureaucracy. The compromise was baked into the new constitution. Karl saw his former boss from the utility. Never a man of any conviction besides advancement. Take a role in the new city department tasked with repairing sewers. He had joined the party in 1933. He had been stern with a Jewish subordinate in 1937. He had signed a letter in 1942 pointing out the proper use of resources in wartime. His denunciation file classified him a Mitläufer. He smiled with an air of seriousness. Stability required his services. The mathematics of guilt continued under the surface as the mathematics of reconstruction rose on rooftops. A few trials mattered. The Nuremberg trials of high officials in 1945–46 set a tone. There were trials in German courts later of policemen, camp guards, to be resumed with greater rigor in the late 1950s and into the 1960s. But in the years when Karl was learning to plan housing blocks and to speak with a politician's patience to a crowd of angry men about the allocation of plumbing in a new development, the common story was this. Those who went to prison were those who had no political utility. Those who returned to their office desks were those the new state could not or would not do without. The arithmetic of punishment was a tapering curve. After 1949, the Cold War sharpened all angles. The Western occupation zones became the Federal Republic of Germany. The Eastern Zone became the German Democratic Republic. The line between them was not yet a wall, but was already a divide of language and loyalty. "We are a democracy now" was spoken in the West in rooms that were brightly lit and sometimes thinly furnished. "We are democratic, too," was spoken in the East with a pen pointed at a form that ensured the opposite. The politics of memory followed the politics of power. In the West, the 1950s became a decade of economic growth, of home construction, of cars on roads that had been empty, of school books that talked tactfully of dictatorship and of seduction by it, and of the suffering of bombings and expulsions. In the East, anti-fascism became the founding myth. The communists, many of whom had suffered in concentration camps, declared themselves the only true opponents of Nazism. Both stories left much unsaid. Karl had a son in 1950. He named him Thomas. He stood outside the new maternity clinic with other men in coats and caps who lit cigarettes nervously and smiled less than Americans do in photographs from the same years. He bought a stroller. It had rubber tires. He wrote in his notebook on 23 February 1950, "My son will grow up in a country where the factory whistles are ordinary again." May he not learn the arithmetic of hunger. He could not give him that guarantee, but he could carry him on his shoulders through the square of their new housing complex, where children drew with chalk on the pavement and a woman hung laundry from a window, and the future, if it could be sketched, looked like laundry lines and bicycle tires. In schools, the syllabus changed steadily but slowly. The new teachers, sometimes the old teachers, taught a curriculum that padded the past lightly. A child learned about Charlemagne, Luther, Bismarck, the inflation of the 1920s, the seizure of power, and then the war. The words Jews and concentration camps appeared, but in proportion that often made the past gentle. The textbook mathematics was political. It served the story the state needed. We were misled, we suffered, we rebuilt. The Tag Day for expellees. The Tag der Heimat became a ritual, a way for those who had walked west with bundles to say their story out loud and for politicians to nod solemnly. There were fewer rituals for those who had been expelled to their deaths. The calculus of commemoration in the 1950s was heavy on one side of the ledger. Meanwhile, the DP world shifted to a different rhythm. The camps closed one by one. Feldafing was gone by 1951. Landsberg, after a period of half-life, disappeared as its inhabitants moved out, some to Israel, some to Canada, some to the United States, some Jewish and non-Jewish into German cities full of wary neighbors. Fehrenwald became a place in transition. Jewish families lived there into the early 1950s in conditions that were better than 1945 and worse than normal, and then moved on. The camp would later become a housing settlement, renamed, repurposed, with the smell of wood smoke replaced by the smell of paint. The word Fehrenwald would mean different things in different mouths. In 1952, a committee decided to secularize the cemetery. Minutes were written in a dry style that hid any trace of human feeling. The bureaucratic voice did not forget, it just filed feeling under miscellaneous. Stanislaus secured a visa to Canada in late 1951. He had waited long. He had endured 2 interrogations by American counterintelligence because he had known men who knew men in the Home Army, a category of interest to Americans because the new Cold War made Catherine wheels where before there were rectangles. He had produced his letters, one from the woman he had hidden, now in Haifa, another from a Jewish man in Munich who had seen him barter bread for a sick child in the camp, a third from a Polish priest who knew his family. He had signed a declaration he was not a communist. He had sworn as much to every authority that asked he would do any work. He had the mathematics of it ready. He knew how to calculate how much to say and to whom. Before he left, he came to the city for the last time to trade the last things that could be turned into lighter luggage, a heavy pot for 3 bars of soap, a wooden-handled hammer for a pair of gloves. He saw Karl in the crowd near the tram, recognized him, nodded. The recognition was not a friendship. It was a ledger noted and balanced. They had exchanged items and words and a look once when Stanislaw had handed Karl a letter. From a woman, he had said, and smiled slightly, a knowing smile that said he knew what it meant to carry someone else's sentence. It was a letter to a German woman from a Jewish neighbor who had returned in 1946 and was leaving again. I am alive. The city is not mine now. Be well. It was a letter that could have been for any addresses, any names. Karl put it in his pocket and carried it to an apartment with a new door and an old smell. If we look for documents, we find some: employment rosters, denazification files, Allied intelligence summaries, the minutes of a city council meeting in 1950 that talk about how to name the new streets. There are also oral histories recorded with careful microphones in the 1990s, in which men and women with white hair speak of the 1940s and 1950s as if they were yesterday. We did what we had to do, say some. We knew more than we admitted, say others. We learned to be quiet, say many. The mathematics of silence is complicated. People measure what to say by who is listening, what their children know, what is possible to change by saying it. In 1954, the American military turned more things over to the West German authorities and then stayed as a friendly occupying force and an ally. The Soviet zone was fully another country, with a police that spoke German and functioned like a language imported from elsewhere. The border,